In a crowded courtroom, a wounded veteran fights to keep the military dog who saved his life in Afghanistan. When the German Shepherd suddenly begins barking at an unseen threat, the routine hearing transforms into a tense standoff. As mysterious figures emerge from the shadows, the dog's extraordinary abilities reveal a classified military program and powers beyond normal canine training. His uncanny intuition becomes their only warning against imminent danger. Could this loyal companion's mysterious sixth sense be more than just exceptional training? What dark secrets lie behind this special bond, and will it be enough to protect them from those who want to reclaim what they consider government property? Let's find out. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes breathing feel like a task. Every seat was filled, and all eyes were fixed on the man at the center of it all. Sergeant Marcus Reynolds sat in his wheelchair, dressed in his military uniform, the medals on his chest glinting under the fluorescent lights. His hand gripped the leash of the dog by his side. Atlas, a German shepherd, with a calm yet watchful demeanor. To everyone else, Atlas looked like any other military working dog, but to Marcus, he was so much more. He was family. Memories of Kandahar flashed through Marcus's mind as he waited for the proceedings to begin. 3 years ago, during his 4th deployment, he and Atlas had been assigned to clear a suspected insurgent compound. The mission had started like any other, methodical, precise, following protocols that had been drilled into them both. Atlas had been 2 years into service then, already showing exceptional abilities that set him apart from other military working dogs. That day, the air had been thick with dust, the heat oppressive even in the early morning hours. "Clear the eastern quadrant," Captain Rivera had ordered, her voice crackling through the radio. "Reynolds, take point with Atlas." Marcus remembered nodding, signaling to Atlas with a subtle hand gesture. The dog had moved forward with practiced precision, his nose working the air, his ears alert to sounds imperceptible to human ears. They had cleared 2 buildings without incident, the routine almost lulling them into a false sense of security. It was the 3rd building where everything changed. Atlas had stopped suddenly, his body rigid, a low growl emanating from deep in his chest. Marcus had learned to trust that growl. It had saved their unit more times than he could count. "Hold," Marcus had whispered into his radio. "Atlas has something." The explosion came seconds later, not from the building they were approaching, but from behind them. The world erupted into chaos, the ground beneath them disappearing as Marcus was thrown through the air. The last thing he remembered before darkness claimed him was Atlas's bark, urgent and protective, and the feeling of teeth gently but firmly gripping his collar, dragging him away from the inferno. Marcus's jaw tightened as Judge Harold Winters addressed him, reminding him that this might be his final chance to speak. The Army had decided Atlas was to be reassigned, considered government property needed for another mission. After years of risking their lives together, the thought of losing Atlas now felt like a cruel betrayal. Marcus's hands trembled as he adjusted his grip on the leash, his voice barely steady enough to speak. In the 3rd row of the gallery, Sophia Chen adjusted her glasses and scribbled notes in her small leather-bound notebook. As a reporter for the Military Times, she had covered dozens of cases involving veterans, but something about this one felt different. Perhaps it was the palpable tension in the room, or the way the sergeant's hand never left his dog's leash, as if letting go meant losing a part of himself. She had interviewed Marcus Reynolds 2 days ago, and his words still echoed in her mind. "Atlas isn't just a military asset," he had told her, his eyes never leaving the dog resting at his feet. "He's the reason I'm alive, not just because he pulled me from that explosion, but because he gave me purpose when I came home." The military wants to treat him like equipment that can be reassigned, but you can't reassign family. Sophia glanced down at her notes. The legal argument seemed straightforward. The military owned Atlas, and despite Marcus's injuries and honorable discharge, the dog's specialized training made him valuable for ongoing operations. But watching them now, the way Atlas leaned slightly against Marcus's wheelchair, his eyes constantly scanning the room as if still on duty, Sophia knew this case transcended legal technicalities. It was about loyalty, about bonds forged in circumstances most civilians could never understand. Judge Winters shuffled the papers before him, his expression carefully neutral. At 63, with nearly 3 decades on the bench, Harold Winters had presided over hundreds of cases, but few had generated the public interest of Reynolds v. United States Army. His email inbox had been flooded with messages from veterans groups, animal rights advocates, and ordinary citizens, all pleading for him to rule in favor of the sergeant. Privately, Winters sympathized with Reynolds. His own son had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, returning with invisible scars that no amount of therapy seemed to heal. But sympathy couldn't dictate his ruling. The law was clear regarding military working dogs and their status as government property. Still, as he looked at the man before him, dignified despite his obvious pain, Winters found himself hoping for a solution that the letter of the law might not provide. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his tone raw with emotion, "Atlas isn't just a military asset. He saved my life in ways no one here could ever understand. In the field, he pulled me from danger, shielded me from gunfire, even warned me of traps before I could see them. And when I came home, when I couldn't even face myself in the mirror, Atlas was there. He gave me a reason to keep going. Please don't take him from me." The nightmares had been the worst. For months after returning home, Marcus would wake in the middle of the night, his body drenched in sweat, the sounds of explosions and gunfire still ringing in his ears. The doctors had a clinical term for it, post-traumatic stress disorder. But no clinical term could capture the suffocating darkness that threatened to consume him. On those nights, it was Atlas who would nudge him awake before the nightmares reached their crescendo. The dog would rest his head on Marcus's chest, his warm weight anchoring Marcus to reality, reminding him that he wasn't alone, that he had survived for a reason. Atlas had been trained to detect changes in his handler's breathing, in his scent, subtle shifts that signaled distress. But what had begun as training had evolved into something deeper, an intuitive understanding that transcended commands and protocols. "The first time I considered ending it all," Marcus had confided to his VA therapist, Dr. Patel, "Atlas wouldn't leave my side. He knocked the pill bottle out of my hand, then sat on my feet until the moment passed." How do you explain that to people who see him as just a piece of equipment? How do you make them understand that separating us wouldn't just be cruel, it could be fatal? The room remained utterly still, the air thick with unspoken sympathy. Some spectators dabbed their eyes while others exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of pity and outrage. Judge Winters' face remained neutral, his eyes studying Marcus for a long moment before he leaned forward, preparing to deliver his ruling. At the back of the courtroom, Captain Laura Montgomery shifted uncomfortably in her seat. As the Army's representative, she was there to ensure the military's interests were protected, but the human drama unfolding before her made her question the position she was defending. She had worked with military working dogs throughout her career and understood their value in the field. Atlas had been specifically trained in explosive detection and had shown exceptional aptitude, abilities that could save countless lives if he were redeployed. But watching Reynolds now, seeing the unbreakable bond between man and dog, Montgomery found herself wondering if there wasn't a better solution. Perhaps one of the newer dogs in the program could be fast-tracked through training. Perhaps exceptions could be made in cases like this, where the handler had been severely injured in service. She made a mental note to discuss alternatives with her superiors, regardless of the judge's ruling today. But before the words could leave his mouth, something unexpected happened. Atlas stood abruptly, yanking the leash free from Marcus's trembling hands. The dog moved toward the judge, barking sharply, his voice echoing through the courtroom. The crowd gasped, and the bailiff stepped forward instinctively, though Atlas showed no signs of aggression. His barks were insistent, purposeful, as if he were trying to communicate something urgent. "Atlas," Marcus called, his voice breaking with panic. But deep down, he knew. He had seen this behavior before, countless times on the battlefield. Atlas wasn't just barking, he was alerting. Raymond Chen, the larger of the two bailiffs, instinctively moved his hand to his holster. In his 15 years of courthouse security, he had never seen an animal behave this way during proceedings. The dog wasn't lunging or showing teeth, typical signs of aggression. But something about the intensity of his barking set Raymond on edge. His partner, Derek Sullivan, caught his eye across the room, his expression mirroring Raymond's concern. "Easy," Raymond murmured, trying to assess whether the dog posed a threat to the judge. Judge Winters himself seemed frozen, his gavel suspended midair, his eyes wide as he watched the German Shepherd. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone whispered from the back row. Sophia Chen stood up from her seat, her reporter's instincts telling her that something significant was happening. This wasn't just a disruption in court proceedings. The dog's behavior was too specific, too focused. She had researched military working dogs extensively for this story and knew that their training was specialized and precise. Atlas wasn't having some kind of canine meltdown. He was responding to something. "He's detecting something," she whispered to the elderly man seated beside her. "These dogs are trained to alert their handlers to specific threats." The man looked at her skeptically. "In a courtroom? What kind of threat could there be here?" Sophia shook her head, her eyes never leaving Atlas. "I don't know, but I've never seen anything like this." Marcus's chest tightened as he wheeled himself forward, his voice trembling. "He's not just barking. He only does this when there's danger. He's trying to warn us about something." The memories flooded back, of Atlas alerting to the hidden IED that would have killed their entire unit, of the dog sensing an ambush before their human intelligence had any indication, of countless moments when Atlas's instincts had proven more reliable than any technology or tactical plan. Marcus had learned to trust those instincts without question, a trust that had been forged in blood and fire. There was this one time in Helmand Province, Staff Sergeant James Rodriguez had told Sophia during her research. Reynolds and Atlas were attached to our unit for a routine patrol. Everything seemed normal, locals going about their business, kids playing in the streets. But Atlas suddenly started acting weird, pulling Reynolds toward this abandoned market stall. Reynolds trusted the dog enough to call for a full stop. Turns out there was a pressure plate IED right in our path. Would have taken out at least half the squad. That dog saved a lot of lives that day. Judge Winters froze, his gavel forgotten in his hand, his eyes locked on Atlas. The room fell silent again, except for the dog's barks echoing like a heartbeat. Whatever Atlas sensed, it wasn't just about Marcus. The dog knew something no one else did, and for the first time that day, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just a goodbye. Something bigger was about to unfold, and Atlas was determined to make them all see it. The room was silent except for Atlas's relentless barking. Each sharp sound echoed in the vast courtroom, bouncing off the dark wooden walls and cutting through the tension like a blade. Atlas's stance was low, his body tense, ears pinned back, and eyes locked on the judge's bench. Marcus's grip tightened on the armrests of his wheelchair as he watched the dog. This wasn't random barking. Atlas's body language was unmistakable. He had detected something. Judge Winters slowly lowered his gavel, his earlier irritation giving way to unease. In his decades on the bench, he had developed an almost instinctive ability to read a room, to sense when something was amiss. The dog's behavior was too specific, too directed to dismiss as simple disruption. "Mr. Chen," he said quietly to the bailiff nearest him, "perhaps we should—" But before he could finish his thought, Atlas's barking pattern changed, becoming more urgent, more insistent. The shift was subtle, but to Marcus, who had worked with Atlas for years, it was as clear as if the dog had spoken aloud. Immediate threat. Marcus's heart pounded, a rush of adrenaline reminding him of moments on the battlefield. But this wasn't war. This was supposed to be a courtroom, a place of order. "Atlas, heel," Marcus called, his voice firm but trembling. Atlas briefly glanced back at him, his gaze sharp as if to reassure his handler that he was in control. Then, without hesitation, Atlas returned his focus, pacing in short, deliberate steps in front of the judge's bench. His barks shifted to deep, guttural growls that sent a shiver through the room. Derek Sullivan, the smaller bailiff, moved closer to Judge Winters, his hand hovering near his weapon. Unlike his partner Raymond, Derek had served in the military before joining courthouse security. He had worked alongside K-9 units and recognized the dog's behavior for what it was, a trained response to a perceived threat. "Judge," he said quietly, "I think we should clear the courtroom." Winters hesitated, torn between maintaining the dignity of his court and acknowledging the growing sense that something was very wrong. The decision was complicated by the media presence. Sophia Chen wasn't the only reporter in attendance, and evacuating the courtroom over a dog's behavior could make headlines that would embarrass the court. But as he looked at Atlas, at the unmistakable intensity of the animal's focus, Winters felt a chill run down his spine. The audience began murmuring nervously, the earlier sympathy for Marcus now morphing into palpable unease. "Mr. Reynolds," Judge Winters said, his tone laced with irritation, "control your dog or I will have to—" "Your Honor," Marcus interrupted, his voice louder, steadier, though his chest tightened with fear. "Atlas isn't misbehaving. He's trained to detect threats, bombs, explosives, danger. He wouldn't act like this unless he felt something was wrong." Captain Montgomery rose from her seat, her military training taking over as she assessed the situation. "He's right, Your Honor," she called out, drawing surprised glances from those around her. "These dogs undergo thousands of hours of specialized training. Their alert behaviors are specific and reliable." The irony wasn't lost on her. Moments ago, she'd been prepared to argue that Atlas should be returned to active duty because of these variabilities. And now those same abilities were disrupting the proceedings that might have granted her request. But professional duty aside, Montgomery knew better than to ignore a military working dog's warning. "I recommend we take this seriously," she added, her voice carrying the weight of her rank and experience. The room fell silent again as Marcus's words settled in. His explanation shifted the atmosphere, replacing skepticism with a creeping sense of dread. Before anyone could respond, Atlas suddenly stopped barking. The abrupt silence was jarring, almost deafening. Atlas's body went completely rigid as his head snapped toward the far end of the courtroom. His ears perked sharply and a low, menacing growl rumbled from his chest. The shift was so sudden, so intense, that even Judge Winters froze. Sophia Chen felt her journalistic detachment slipping as she watched the scene unfold. This was no longer just a story about a veteran fighting to keep his service dog. It was becoming something else entirely, something that made her pulse quicken and her palms sweat. She glanced toward the doors Atlas was fixated on, half expecting to see armed intruders burst through at any moment. The elderly man beside her leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was in Vietnam," he said, his eyes never leaving Atlas. "Had a scout dog in my unit that acted just like this before we walked into an ambush. Lost 3 men that day. Would have been the whole squad if not for that dog." He shook his head slowly. "Whatever that animal is sensing, it's real." All eyes turned toward the heavy wooden doors leading into the courtroom. A collective unease settled over the room, and the murmurs turned to panicked whispers. Marcus's breathing quickened as he followed Atlas's line of sight, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had seen this exact behavior before on the battlefield, moments before Atlas uncovered a buried explosive or signaled an enemy ambush. Whatever Atlas sensed now wasn't good. "Atlas," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking with tension. "What is it?" Atlas didn't move. His entire body remained locked in place, his growl growing deeper, vibrating through the air like a warning. Whatever danger he had detected, it was no longer just a threat to Marcus. It was something that could put everyone in that room at risk. Raymond Chen exchanged a quick glance with Derek Sullivan, a silent communication born of years working together. Raymond gave a slight nod, and Derek immediately moved toward the judge, positioning himself between Winters and the door Atlas was focused on. Raymond, meanwhile, began slowly making his way toward the back of the courtroom, his movements deliberate, trying not to add to the growing panic. Judge Winters finally found his voice. "This court will take a brief recess," he announced, though his usual authoritative tone was undercut by the slight tremor in his words. "Everyone please remain seated while we—" The low growl from Atlas reverberated through the courtroom like distant thunder, freezing everyone in place. All eyes were fixed on the dog, his body tense, his gaze locked on the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the room. Even Judge Winters, who moments ago had been prepared to reprimand Marcus, now seemed unnerved. His gavel remained forgotten in his hand as he exchanged uneasy glances with the bailiffs. The air felt electric, thick with a tension that no one could explain. Marcus's breath came faster, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair as if bracing himself for a blast. He had seen this before, too many times to count on the battlefield. Atlas's instincts had been the difference between life and death. His warning had always meant one thing. Danger was close, very close. "Stay calm," Marcus murmured to himself, but the words felt hollow even to him. His mind raced back to their training days at Lackland Air Force Base, where Atlas had distinguished himself from the other dogs in the program. The trainers had been amazed by his ability to detect explosives at distances that exceeded their expectations, by his focus that never wavered even under simulated combat conditions. "This dog has something special," Master Sergeant Ortiz had told Marcus. "A sixth sense you can't train into them. They're either born with it or they're not." That sixth sense had manifested most dramatically during their second deployment, when Atlas had refused to enter a building that intelligence had cleared as safe. Marcus had trusted his partner enough to call for a secondary sweep. The building had collapsed 20 minutes later, rigged with explosives that conventional detection methods had missed. Atlas hadn't just sensed the explosives, he had somehow known they were about to detonate. Now, watching Atlas's unwavering focus on the courtroom doors, Marcus felt the same cold certainty settle in his gut. Whatever was coming through those doors wasn't just a threat, it was imminent. The bailiffs, unsure of how to proceed, hesitated by the judge's bench. Raymond Chen, a man with a broad frame and a wary expression, finally stepped forward, his hand resting on the weapon at his hip. "It's just a dog, right?" he muttered, though his voice betrayed his own unease, probably reacting to the noise or the crowd. But even as he spoke, his steps were cautious, his movements deliberate. Marcus shook his head, his voice rising just enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Number Atlas doesn't react to noise or people like this. He's trained to sense danger, things we can't see. Trust me, if he's growling like that, there's a reason. Derek Sullivan nodded, his military experience lending weight to Marcus's words. "He's right," he said quietly to Raymond. "These dogs are different. They're trained to filter out distractions, to focus only on specific threats." Raymond hesitated, torn between protocol and the growing certainty that something unusual was happening. "Should we call for backup?" Derek's eyes remained fixed on Atlas. "Not yet. Let's see what we're dealing with first. But be ready." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. Judge Winters, visibly unsettled, finally nodded at the bailiffs, motioning for them to investigate the door. In the gallery, Sophia Chen had abandoned all pretense of journalistic detachment. Her notebook lay forgotten on her lap as she watched the scene unfold with growing alarm. The tension in the room was palpable, a living thing that seemed to press against her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. Beside her, the elderly Vietnam veteran had gone completely still, his weathered hands gripping the bench in front of him. "Something's coming," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "That dog knows." Atlas's growl grew louder as the bailiffs approached the door. Raymond reached out hesitantly, his hand gripping the metal handle. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Marcus's heart pounded as he watched, every muscle in his body coiled with anticipation. Atlas's body remained rigid, his growls turning into a series of sharp, clipped barks as the handle began to turn. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. At first it seemed empty, but Atlas's barking only intensified, his eyes fixed on something unseen. Raymond took a step into the hallway, his hand still on his weapon. He glanced back at the courtroom, his face pale, and then turned forward again. A second later, his voice broke the silence. "There's something here." Marcus's pulse quickened as he leaned forward in his chair, his chest tight with dread. Whatever something the bailiff had seen, it was enough to make Atlas's instincts flare to life. And Marcus knew better than anyone. Atlas was never wrong. Judge Winters rose slowly from his seat, his judicial composure cracking under the weight of the unknown threat. "Mr. Chen," he called, his voice strained, "what exactly do you see?" Raymond didn't immediately answer, his attention focused on something in the hallway. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with confusion. "I'm not sure, Your Honor. There's a shadow, movement, but..." He trailed off, squinting into the darkness. Derek Sullivan moved closer to the judge, positioning himself protectively. "Your Honor, I recommend we evacuate the courtroom immediately." Winters hesitated, years of judicial procedure warring with the primal instinct for self-preservation. The decision was made for him when Atlas's barking suddenly intensified, the sounds sharp and urgent in a way that made the hair on the back of every neck in the room stand on end. The air in the courtroom seemed to grow heavier, as if the tension itself was pulling the oxygen from the room. Atlas's barking echoed sharply, each sound reverberating off the wooden walls. His body remained locked in a stance of pure alertness. muscles taut, head low, and his gaze fixed like a laser on the dark hallway beyond the open door. Raymond, now visibly uneasy, took another hesitant step forward, his boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. His hand hovered near his weapon, his body stiff with caution, as though expecting something to lunge out of the shadows. "What's going on out there?" Judge Winters demanded, his voice cracking slightly despite his attempt to maintain authority. He gripped the gavel tightly, his knuckles pale as his eyes darted nervously between the doorway and Atlas. The dog's growls deepened, a low, menacing rumble that vibrated through the courtroom and sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. Captain Montgomery had moved to the edge of her seat, her military training kicking in as she assessed potential escape routes and defensive positions. The courtroom, with its limited exits and confined space, was a tactical nightmare. If there was a genuine threat, evacuation would be chaotic at best, deadly at worst. "We need to establish a perimeter," she muttered to herself, falling back on protocols ingrained through years of service. But even as the thought formed, she realized the futility of it. Whatever was happening was already in motion, and they were all caught in its path. Raymond glanced back toward the room, his face pale and tight with uncertainty. "I don't see anything," he said hesitantly, his words measured. "But something doesn't feel right." His gaze shifted back to the hallway, his brow furrowed as if trying to shake off his own doubts. "It's quiet, too quiet." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the silent room like a gunshot. Marcus leaned forward in his wheelchair, his stomach twisting into knots. He had heard those words before, "too quiet," countless times on the battlefield, and they had always preceded disaster. His voice rose, cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd. "Atlas doesn't react to nothing. If he's acting like this, there's a reason. We need to evacuate the room now." His command rang with urgency, but the spectators froze, paralyzed by fear and confusion. Sophia Chen was the first to move, rising from her seat and gesturing to those around her. "We need to leave," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Now." Her movement seemed to break the spell, and several others began to stand, gathering their belongings with shaking hands. But before they could move toward the exits, Atlas's barking pattern changed again. Sharper, more frantic, a sound that Marcus recognized with chilling clarity. "Everyone down," he shouted, his military command voice cutting through the growing chaos. "Get down now." Derek stepped forward, drawing a flashlight from his belt and aiming the beam into the hallway. The bright light cut through the shadows, illuminating the length of the polished floor. "There's nothing," he muttered, his tone uneasy. "It's just an empty hallway." But even as he spoke, his hand trembled slightly, betraying his calm facade. Atlas, however, was far from calm. The dog's growling only grew louder, his barking more frantic as his body strained forward, almost yanking the leash from Marcus's grip. Judge Winters had finally abandoned all pretense of judicial composure. "Clear the courtroom," he ordered, his voice sharp with fear. "Everyone out through the side exits now." The command broke the paralysis that had gripped the room. People began moving at once, some rushing for the doors, others helping those who seemed frozen with fear. Captain Montgomery was on her feet, directing the evacuation with practiced efficiency, her military training providing a structure for the chaos. "Orderly exit," she called, her voice cutting through the panic. "No running, no pushing. Move quickly but calmly." Suddenly, a sharp metallic clang echoed down the hallway, the sound unmistakable and jarring in the suffocating silence. Derek flinched, his flashlight beam shaking as he instinctively stepped back. Atlas lunged toward the sound, barking ferociously, his claws scraping against the floor as he strained against his leash. Gasps erupted from the courtroom, and panic began to ripple through the crowd. Raymond instinctively drew his weapon, his voice tight with alarm. "What the hell was that?" Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he raised his voice above the chaos. "Get back!" he yelled, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and certainty. "He's never wrong. Something's coming." The evacuation faltered as people turned back toward the sound, fear and curiosity warring on their faces. Sophia Chen found herself caught in the middle of the room, her journalist's instinct to document warring with her survival instinct to flee. The elderly Vietnam veteran grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the side exit. "Don't be a fool," he hissed. "When a dog like that gives warning, you listen." But before they could reach the exit, the metallic clang sounded again, louder this time, followed by a sound that froze the blood in everyone's veins. A low, humorless chuckle that seemed to emanate from the darkness itself. But before anyone could respond, the metallic clang echoed again, louder this time, as if whatever had caused it was now much closer. The air felt thick, charged with an invisible energy that sent a wave of dread through the room. Whatever Atlas had sensed, it was no longer a question of if, it was now a question of when. The metallic clang echoed again, sharper, closer, like an alarm ringing in the depths of the hallway. The tension in the courtroom snapped tighter, the weight of the unknown pressing down on everyone present. Atlas barked ferociously, his body straining against the leash as though his sheer will could push through the doorway and confront whatever was out there. Marcus gripped the leash tightly, his knuckles white, his pulse racing in his ears. He could feel it now, too. Something was wrong. Something was coming. Judge Winters had abandoned his bench entirely, moving quickly toward the judicial chambers behind him. "Everyone out!" he commanded again, his voice cracking with urgency. "Use all available exits." But even as he spoke, a new sound emerged from the hallway. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching with unhurried confidence. The sound sent a collective shudder through the room, halting the evacuation as effectively as a physical barrier. Derek Sullivan's military training took over, his body shifting into a defensive stance as he raised his weapon. "Identify yourself," he called into the hallway, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. Only silence answered him, followed by another deliberate footstep, closer now. Raymond stepped fully into the hallway, his gun drawn and his eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor. Derek followed cautiously, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but the hallway appeared empty, silent, and still. Yet Atlas's barking didn't waver, his growls growing deeper, more insistent. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to act, to shout for an evacuation, but he could already see the fear paralyzing the room. No one was moving. "Do you see anything?" Judge Winters called out, his voice cracking as he leaned forward in his seat. The gavel trembled slightly in his hand, and his usual air of authority was replaced with an unmistakable edge of fear. Raymond glanced over his shoulder, his face pale and glistening with sweat. "Nothing yet," he said, his voice low but tight, as if he were afraid that speaking too loudly would provoke whatever might be lurking. "But it doesn't feel right." Captain Montgomery had positioned herself near Marcus, her military training recognizing the value of staying close to the dog that was their only early warning system. "Reynolds," she said quietly, using his military title out of habit, "how reliable is Atlas's threat detection?" Marcus's eyes never left the hallway as he answered. 100%. In 3 years of active deployment, He never gave a false positive. If he says something's there, it's there. Montgomery nodded, her decision made. Then we trust the dog. She turned to the nearest group of civilians, her voice low but commanding. Move toward the side exits, quickly and quietly. No sudden movements. He took another step forward, the weight of his boots echoing down the hall. The spectators in the courtroom whispered nervously, some clutching their belongings, others inching toward the exits. The uneasy energy in the room was spreading like wildfire. Marcus wheeled himself forward slightly, his eyes locked on Atlas, who had gone silent again. The dog's ears were rigid, his body motionless, his eyes still fixed on the open doorway. Atlas is locked onto something, Marcus said, his voice trembling. I don't know what it is, but it's there. Sophia Chen had managed to reach one of the side exits, but found herself unable to leave. Whatever was happening in this courtroom was unprecedented, a story unlike any she had covered before. Her journalistic instincts overcame her fear as she pulled out her phone, activating the camera function with trembling fingers. If something was about to happen, there should be a record of it. This is insane, whispered a woman beside her, clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. It's just a dog barking. Why is everyone so scared? Sophia didn't answer, her eyes fixed on Atlas, on the intensity of his focus that made her own skin prickle with dread. Whatever the dog sensed, it wasn't imagination, and it wasn't nothing. And then, just as Raymond reached the halfway point in the hallway, a shadow moved. It was brief, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make Derek stumble backward, his flashlight beam jerking wildly. There, he shouted, his voice filled with panic. Raymond froze, his gun snapping up, aimed at the darkness. Atlas erupted into barking again, lunging so hard against his leash that Marcus's grip nearly gave out. Back up, Marcus shouted, his voice echoing in the courtroom. Get out of there. Judge Winters slammed his gavel, trying to regain order, but the sound was swallowed by the growing chaos. People were rising from their seats, murmurs turning to shouts as the panic spread. Judge Winters' attempts to maintain order were drowned by the rising tide of fear. Years of courtroom decorum dissolved in seconds as self-preservation took precedence over procedure. He abandoned his bench entirely, moving quickly toward his chambers, gesturing for his clerk to follow. Call security, he ordered, though his voice was lost in the commotion. Get every available officer up here now. But even as he reached the door to his chambers, Atlas's barking shifted again. A new pattern, more urgent than before, that made Judge Winters freeze in his tracks. Something in that sound, in its desperate intensity, told him that running might no longer be an option. And then from the darkness of the hallway came another sound, a heavy, deliberate footstep. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't rushed. It was calm, and it was getting closer. Atlas's barking turned into a snarl, his teeth bared as his body pushed forward with unrelenting force. Marcus felt his chest tighten as dread flooded his body. Whatever was in that hallway wasn't in a hurry. It wasn't hiding. It was coming straight for them, and it wanted to be seen. The evacuation had stalled completely now, the civilians frozen in place, caught between the exits and the magnetic pull of the unfolding drama. Captain Montgomery had positioned herself between the crowd and the hallway, her military bearing a small island of calm in the sea of chaos. Everyone needs to move toward the exits, she commanded, her voice carrying the weight of authority. Now! But her words seemed to evaporate in the thick tension of the room. No one moved. All eyes remained fixed on the doorway, on the darkness that seemed to be taking shape, coalescing into something tangible. The heavy footstep echoed louder than the courtroom could bear, cutting through the growing chaos like a blade. Atlas's snarls filled the air, his body pulling against the leash with such force that Marcus had to anchor himself in his wheelchair to keep from being yanked forward. The tension was suffocating now, every pair of eyes locked on the dark hallway, the source of the sound that no one wanted to face. "Everyone stay calm," Judge Winters shouted, slamming his gavel again. But the command fell on deaf ears. People were rising from their seats, clutching their bags, their hands, anything they could find, as if holding on to something would save them from the unknown threat. Raymond stood frozen in the hallway, his gun raised and aimed into the darkness. Derek remained behind him, the flashlight beam darting nervously across the walls, catching every shadow but revealing nothing concrete. Marcus's voice broke through the mounting noise. "Get out of there," he shouted, his tone sharp and urgent. "Whatever it is, it's not safe." The memory of Kandahar flashed through Marcus's mind. The stillness before chaos, the sixth sense that had kept him alive through 4 deployments. This felt the same, that electric tension in the air before an ambush, before an IED detonated, before the world exploded into violence. His military training kicked in, overriding his physical limitations. "Atlas, guard!" he commanded, his voice steady for the first time since the hearing began. The command was one they had practiced countless times, a directive for Atlas to position himself between his handler and any perceived threat. Atlas responded instantly, shifting his stance slightly while maintaining his focus on the hallway. The simple act of falling back on their training steadied Marcus, giving him a framework for the chaos unfolding around them. His words cut like a knife, but Raymond didn't move. Instead, he squinted into the dim corridor, his jaw tight, and then the shadow moved again. This time it was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, purposeful. Derek gasped audibly, his flashlight shaking in his trembling hand. "There's someone there," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The light caught something for a fraction of a second, a silhouette, tall and looming. It disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, retreating back into the darkness. But it was enough to send a wave of fear rippling through the room. Raymond tightened his grip on his weapon, his voice steady but low. "Show yourself," he barked, his tone commanding. "Step out where I can see you." Sophia Chen's journalistic instincts were in overdrive, her phone recording every moment of the unfolding scene. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to keep the camera steady, documenting what might be the most extraordinary courtroom incident in recent history. Whatever was about to emerge from that hallway, the world needed to see it. "This is insane," whispered the woman beside her, her voice tight with fear. "We should be running." "Sometimes a story is worth the risk," Sophia replied, though her own heart was hammering against her ribs. The reporter in her recognized that this was no ordinary threat. The coordinated response of the dog, the military captain, and the veteran sergeant all pointed to something beyond typical courthouse security concerns. But the only response was silence, thick, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Atlas's barking reached a fever pitch, his teeth bared as his body coiled like a spring ready to lunge. And then it happened. The figure stepped into the light, slowly, calmly, almost unnervingly so. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood, his hands tucked into the pockets of a heavy coat. His movements were deliberate, his posture oddly relaxed despite the chaos he'd caused. He stopped just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, his head tilted slightly as if amused by the scene in front of him. The man's presence seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the room. There was something wrong about him, something that went beyond the obvious threat he posed. His confidence was unnatural, as if he knew something no one else did, as if he held all the cards in a game the others didn't even know they were playing. Captain Montgomery's military training kicked in as she assessed the stranger. His stance, his bearing, the calculated way he moved. This wasn't some random intruder. This was someone with training, with purpose, with a specific objective. She had seen that kind of focused intent before, in operatives who had been extensively prepared for high-risk missions. Military, she whispered to herself, though she couldn't identify any specific branch or unit from his appearance, or something like it. Atlas's growling turned feral, his claws scraping the floor as Marcus strained to hold him back. "Who are you?" Raymond demanded, his gun locked on the figure. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took another slow step forward, the faintest hint of a smirk visible beneath the shadow of his hood. Marcus's breath caught in his chest as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. Something about the man felt wrong, not just threatening, but deeply, fundamentally wrong. Judge Winters had retreated to the relative safety of his bench, his authority now a thin veneer over his obvious fear. The courtroom, once a bastion of order and procedure, had transformed into something unrecognizable. A battleground where the rules no longer applied, where the threat was unknown and the danger palpable. "This court is adjourned," he announced, his voice cracking slightly. "Everyone please exit in an orderly—" But his words died in his throat as the hooded figure raised a hand, the simple gesture somehow more threatening than any weapon could have been. The man raised his hand slowly, the motion causing both bailiffs to tense and grip their weapons tighter. "Relax," the man said, his voice low, calm and chillingly confident. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." But the way he spoke, the way his words lingered in the air, only made the room feel colder. Marcus knew immediately this man was lying, and Atlas knew it too. The stranger's voice carried an accent Marcus couldn't quite place. Not regional, not foreign, but something else, something that seemed to shift and change even as he spoke. It was as if his words were being translated through some invisible filter, rendered comprehensible but still fundamentally alien. "Captain Montgomery," the man said suddenly, his gaze shifting to where she stood. "Still fighting the Army's battles, I see. Some things never change." Montgomery stiffened, her face draining of color. "How do you know my name?" she demanded, her hand instinctively moving toward her hip, though she carried no weapon in the civilian courtroom. The man's smile widened slightly. "I know many things, Captain. More than you might think." The room fell into a stunned silence as the man stood at the edge of the hallway, his figure partially illuminated by the unsteady beam of the flashlight. Atlas's growls were now constant, low and guttural, vibrating through the tense courtroom. The bailiffs held their weapons firm, their hands trembling despite their years of training. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the stranger. The man's posture was too calm, too deliberate, as if he thrived on the unease he was creating. "Step forward slowly," Raymond ordered, his voice tight with authority, though a hint of fear seeped into his tone. The man tilted his head slightly, his face still obscured by the hood, and then took one step closer, his boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. He moved with an unsettling confidence, each movement slow and calculated, as though he were savoring every second of the attention now fixated on him. In the tense silence, Sophia Chen continued recording, her journalistic instincts overriding her fear. This was no ordinary courthouse disruption. The stranger's demeanor, the dog's reaction, the military captain's recognition, all pointed to something much bigger, much more significant than a simple security breach. "Who is he?" whispered the woman beside her, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Sophia replied, her eyes never leaving the scene unfolding before them. "But I intend to find out." The elderly Vietnam veteran beside her shook his head slowly. "This isn't right," he muttered. "Something about this feels orchestrated." Atlas barked furiously, lunging forward against his leash, his claws scraping the floor. Marcus struggled to hold him back, his palms slick with sweat as his grip tightened. "Atlas knows," Marcus muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "He can sense it. He knows something's not right." His words weren't loud enough to reach the crowd, but Judge Winters glanced at him briefly, his expression a mixture of fear and confusion. Derek stepped forward, flashlight in one hand and his other hovering near his holster. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "identify yourself now." Derek's military background surfaced in his stance, in the way he positioned himself slightly to the side of the stranger, minimizing his profile as a target. His years in the courthouse had dulled some of those instincts, but they returned now, sharp and clear in the face of danger. "Sullivan!" Raymond called, his voice tight with tension. "Don't get too close." But Derek had already committed to his approach, his training telling him that establishing control of the situation was paramount. "Sir," he repeated, his voice steadier now, "I need you to identify yourself and state your business in this courthouse." The man finally lifted his head, his face partially visible beneath the shadow of his hood. His eyes were sharp, cold, and piercing, holding an intensity that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," the man repeated, his voice calm yet unnerving, hollow. He reached into his pocket slowly, causing both bailiffs to stiffen and raise their weapons further. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and someone in the back whispered, "He's got something." Marcus's military training kicked in as he assessed the situation. The courtroom offered little tactical advantage. Too many civilians, limited cover, restricted movement due to his wheelchair. Atlas was their best asset, but also a responsibility. Marcus couldn't risk him charging the stranger without knowing what they were facing. "Easy, Atlas," he murmured, though his own body was tense with anticipation. "Wait for it." The command was familiar to them both, a directive to hold position until given the signal to engage. Atlas's growling continued, but his lunging ceased, his body coiled and ready but under control. Captain Montgomery had positioned herself closer to Marcus now, her voice low as she spoke. "Reynolds, if this goes south, you need to get yourself and the civilians out. I'll handle the threat." Marcus nodded slightly, though they both knew his mobility limitations made rapid evacuation challenging at best. Still, having another trained military presence beside him was reassuring, a small counterweight to the overwhelming dread that filled the room. The room felt ready to erupt, the tension a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to act, but he was frozen, gripping Atlas's leash as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the moment. The stranger's hand emerged from his pocket, holding something small and metallic. The bailiffs shouted in unison, "Drop it!" The man froze, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Relax," he said smoothly, holding the object up. It glinted in the dim light, revealing itself to be a simple key. But Marcus's unease only deepened. There was no relief in the air, no sense of safety. Atlas's barking didn't falter, his focus locked on the man as if the key was nothing but a distraction. The key itself seemed ordinary enough. Small, metallic, possibly for a padlock or a small case. But something about the way the man held it, the way his fingers caressed its surface, suggested it was anything but ordinary. It was as if he were holding something precious, something powerful. "A key to what?" Raymond demanded, his weapon still trained on the stranger. The man's smile widened slightly, revealing teeth that were too perfect, too white. "To the truth, Officer Chen," he replied, the use of Raymond's name sending another wave of unease through the room. "Isn't that what everyone here is looking for? The truth about Atlas, about what makes him so special?" Marcus's grip on the leash tightened as he whispered to himself, "It's not what it looks like. He's hiding something. He has to be." The man's smile widened, as if he could hear Marcus's thoughts, and the dread in the room became suffocating. Sophia Chen zoomed in with her phone camera, focusing on the key in the stranger's hand. Something about it seemed off. The metal had an unusual luster, almost iridescent under the flashlight's beam. It didn't look like any standard key she'd seen before. "What's happening?" the woman beside her whispered, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know," Sophia replied honestly. "But whatever it is, it's bigger than a custody hearing for a military dog." The elderly veteran nodded slowly, his weathered face grim. "That man knows something about the dog," he murmured. "This was never about the court case. It was about getting to the animal." The room felt like it was on the verge of imploding, all eyes locked on the man holding the key, his smirk a sharp contrast to the panic spreading through the courtroom. Atlas's barking was relentless, his growls deep and guttural, as if trying to sound an alarm no one could ignore. Marcus's hands trembled as he tightened his grip on the leash, his chest heaving with the weight of his instincts, screaming louder than the chaos around him. Something wasn't right. This man wasn't just a threat. He was the tip of something much larger, much darker. "Drop the key and back away," Raymond barked again, his weapon still trained on the man. Derek edged closer, flashlight steady, but his face pale with unease. The man, seemingly unfazed by the guns pointed at him, tilted his head slightly, his gaze flickering toward Atlas. "That dog," he said, his voice low and almost conversational. "He's special, isn't he? Always knows things before they happen. That's what makes him so valuable." The words sent a chill through Marcus that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Atlas's abilities had always been exceptional, even by the standards of military working dogs, but they had been documented only in classified reports, in observations shared among his unit. The average person wouldn't know about the dog's almost preternatural sense for danger, his ability to detect threats before they materialize. "Project Sentinel," the man continued, his voice dropping lower, the words barely audible to anyone beyond Marcus and Captain Montgomery. "That was the official designation, wasn't it? A program to enhance canine threat detection through unconventional means." Montgomery's face drained of color, her posture stiffening visibly. "How do you know about that?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's smile only widened. "As I said, Captain, I know many things." His tone was calm, but the weight of his words sent a ripple of dread through the room. Marcus's stomach dropped. How did this man know about Atlas, about his abilities, his instincts? The hair on the back of Marcus's neck stood on end as he forced himself to speak. "How do you know that?" he demanded, his voice sharp and shaking in equal measure. Atlas barked even louder, lunging forward against the leash as if trying to protect Marcus from something only he could see. The mention of Project Sentinel had unlocked a flood of memories Marcus had tried to suppress. The classified briefings at Lackland, the specialized training modules that differed from standard K9 protocols, the mysterious civilian scientists who observed Atlas's progress with keen interest. At the time, Marcus had been told only that Atlas was part of an advanced detection program, that his exceptional abilities were being studied to improve military working dog training across all branches. But there had been moments, strange moments, when Atlas had demonstrated abilities that went beyond enhanced training, beyond even the most exceptional canine instincts. The time in Helmand, when he had alerted to an ambush before the insurgents were even in position. The incident in Kandahar when he had led Marcus away from a building minutes before it collapsed, despite no visible or olfactory signs of explosives. The countless nights when Atlas had woken Marcus from nightmares before they reached their crescendo, as if the dog could sense the terror building in his handler's mind. "What is Project Sentinel?" Marcus demanded, his voice stronger now, fueled by a growing anger. "What did they do to him?" The man's smirk grew, his eyes glinting with something sinister. Elias Mercer slowly raised the key, his movements deliberate, almost taunting. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice chilling in its certainty. And then, with a sharp, metallic click, he turned the key in his hand. The sound was subtle, but its effect was immediate. Atlas erupted into a frenzy, barking louder than ever, and before anyone could react, the lights in the courtroom flickered violently. A moment of pure darkness swept through the room, and in the black void, Marcus could hear gasps, shouts, and the scrape of chairs as people scrambled in fear. When the lights flickered back on, Elias Mercer was no longer alone. Behind him, emerging from the hallway like shadows come to life, were two more figures. Their faces were obscured, but their movements were deliberate, their presence radiating menace. Both were holding weapons, sharp metallic shapes that caught the light just enough to make their purpose clear. Marcus's heart raced as he looked at Atlas, who was now growling so ferociously it sounded almost primal. Whatever was happening, it was no longer just about a man with a key. This was something much, much bigger, and it had just begun. The courtroom descended into pure chaos. Spectators pushed toward the exits, voices rising in confusion and fear, while chairs scraped loudly against the floor. The two figures behind Elias Mercer moved further into the room, their presence alone enough to send a ripple of dread through everyone. Atlas barked incessantly, his body low, every muscle in him ready to spring forward. Marcus's grip on the leash tightened as adrenaline surged through him. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that Elias Mercer wasn't bluffing. Atlas was the reason they were here. "Everyone stay calm," the judge yelled, slamming his gavel again, though his voice was drowned out by the panic swelling in the room. The larger bailiff stepped forward, holding his ground, his flashlight now focused on Elias Mercer. "Stay where you are," he commanded. But Elias Mercer didn't stop. Instead, he took another slow step forward, his movements deliberate, his expression eerily calm. The figures behind him mirrored his pace, adding to the suffocating tension. Elias Mercer finally spoke, his voice smooth and measured, cutting through the noise. "No one needs to get hurt. All I want is the dog." His words were calm, but the undertone of awed lassity in his voice sent chills down Marcus's spine. Atlas growled low, his sharp gaze locked on Elias Mercer, unrelenting in his stance. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. "You're not taking him," he said, his voice strong but edged with emotion. He wheeled himself slightly closer to Atlas, keeping his hand firm on the leash. "He's not just a dog. He's my partner, my family. I don't care who you are or what you think you're entitled to. You're not taking him." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Elias Mercer's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing as he studied Marcus. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said coolly. His gaze shifted back to Atlas, the faintest hint of frustration flashing across his face. "He's special, you know that, but keeping him will only make things harder for you." Marcus's jaw tightened, his grip firm on Atlas's leash. "Atlas stays with me," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. Around him, the murmurs of the crowd swelled again, some voices calling for calm, while others whispered in fear about what was going to happen next. The tension in the room felt unbearable, every moment stretching into an eternity. Atlas barked sharply again, snapping the room back to the present. His focus on Elias Mercer was absolute, as if he knew exactly what was at stake. Marcus's chest tightened as he leaned forward in his chair, ready to do whatever it took to protect the one being who had never let him down. Whatever Elias Mercer's intentions were, Marcus was certain of one thing. Atlas wasn't going anywhere, and this standoff was far from over. The courtroom was thick with tension, every person in the room frozen in a state of unease as Elias Mercer stood motionless, his eyes locked on Atlas. The dog's low growls rumbled like distant thunder, his body still coiled and ready to defend. Marcus, gripping the leash with both hands, stared directly at Elias Mercer, his own determination reflecting the unwavering loyalty of his partner at his side. The two figures behind Elias Mercer remained still, their presence looming but no longer advancing. It was a standoff, one that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The judge, breaking the heavy silence, cleared his throat and spoke with all the alacrity he could muster. "You've disrupted a court of law. This ends now. Bailiffs, escort these men out of here." His voice trembled slightly, but it was enough to reignite the tension. The bailiffs, regaining their composure, stepped forward cautiously. Atlas let out another sharp bark, his teeth bared as his eyes followed every move Elias Mercer's made. Elias Mercer raised a hand slowly, signaling his companions to stop. His expression shifted, not to anger, but to something closer to resignation. "This isn't over," he said calmly, his voice carrying an ominous weight. "You think this is just about the dog, but it's much bigger than that. You'll see soon enough." He took a step back, his smirk returning, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold, calculating confidence. "For now I'll leave, but he belongs to us, Marcus, and we'll be back." Marcus's chest tightened, his grip on Atlas's leash never loosening. "He belongs to no one but me," he said firmly, his voice steady and clear. "And whatever it is you're after, you'll have to go through both of us." His words struck like steel, and for the first time, Elias Mercer faltered, his eyes narrowing as if assessing Marcus one final time. Then, without another word, he turned, motioning for his companions to follow him. The tension in the room didn't ease until they had disappeared through the same doors they had entered from. The silence that followed was deafening. Spectators slowly returned to their seats, whispers rippling through the crowd as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. The judge exhaled deeply, setting his gavel down with a shaking hand. "This court is adjourned," he said wearily, his voice barely audible over the murmurs. But Marcus remained where he was, his eyes still fixed on the door. Atlas finally sat down, his growls fading, though his body remained alert. Marcus reached down, his hand gently brushing over the dog's head. "You did good, buddy," he whispered, his voice heavy with gratitude and exhaustion. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Marcus stayed behind, his thoughts racing. He didn't know who that man was or why they wanted Atlas. But one thing was clear: this wasn't over. But for now, as Atlas leaned against his leg, Marcus let himself feel the quiet relief of this moment. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, because no matter what happened, their bond was unbreakable, and that was something no one could take away.